Well, good morning to you. It is good to see each of you in the class this morning. And it sounds like a whole lot of other folks, have some kind of frog in our throats this morning that don't want to turn loose, but hopefully we'll be able to get through our studies together. Okay, we're in the book of Jude in this class. As we have indicated, the book of Jude is really a study of apostasy. Jude begins this section by reminding these brethren of who they are and what they have in Christ Jesus, and the fact that it is needful for him to write unto them to earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered to the saints. And the reason for that, as he states in verse 4, there are certain men crept in unawares. And so he begins to warn them of apostasy. He begins to talk about the inevitable punishment that is coming their way. And he cites three examples of the punishment of God on those who leave the truth. And of course, we have to be concerned about not only those who leave the truth, but who they are able to take with them in the process. And so throughout this letter, that's what he's been talking about up to this point. The three examples that he gives, he talks about those who came out of Egypt and later were destroyed because of unbelief. Then he mentions in the second example those who were disobedient, those angels who kept not their first estate. And then in verse 7 he talks about Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner. And so punishment is inevitable. And those who believe that they can, because of disobedience, transgress the law of God and get away with it, need to reconsider in that regard. Beginning in verse 8, he talks about some of the causes of apostasy. What brings it about? And of course there are numerous other passages that could be cited in this regard, and even among the minor prophets, there is a lot of information about the nation of Israel and their leaving God. Jeremiah talked about those who forget God. And so there are a lot of other passages that we could note in that regard, but Jude now is going beyond the surface to allow his readers to see something of the attitude and the actions of those involved in apostasy. And if we can see it in this book, then in our own day and time, when we see these similar attitudes and these similar actions, we should be able to determine that those individuals are on the road to, if not already, reached the point of apostasy. And so in verses 8, 9, and 10, he deals with that. Likewise, also these filthy dreamers defile the flesh, despise dominion, speak evil of dignities. Yet Michael the archangel, when contending with the devil, he disputed about the body of Moses, durst not bring accusation, or does not bring against him a railing accusation, but saith, the Lord rebuke thee. But these speak evil of those things which they know not, but what they know naturally as brute beasts, in those things they corrupt themselves. So here's somewhat of the cause as we kind of dissect these verses and see what they say to us. And you'll notice he begins in verse 8 by saying, likewise. What does that word suggest? Same as. So you go back and look at those who came out of Egypt and their disobedience, their unbelief. You look at these angels who left their first estate. You look at the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and those cities round about that, and the problems that were there. So in like manner, likewise, in the same way, these who have crept in unawares among you are of the same nature as those people in time past. Now, we suggested at the outset of those three examples that the bottom line of their corruption was going to be disbelief. What does belief involve? If we say we believe in God, what did Jesus say? If you believe in God, believe also in me. And in the process, what's that going to entail? We really believe in God and we believe in Christ as the Son of God, we're going to do His will. We can say we believe in God, but if we have a true belief in God, it's going to lead to obedience. Now, that's when people begin to disbelieve, when they do not accept God for what He is, who He is, what He says, what He's going to do, then they'll begin to live their lives as they please, rather than the way God instructs. And so he begins here giving a description of these false teachers. Their conduct is the same as that mentioned in the preceding verses, that Israel, the angels, those various cities. Now, look at what he says about them. He says, these also dreamers. Now, the word filthy there is supplied by the translators in that regard. Literally, in their dreamings. So what does that suggest to you? Is this talking about dreams and the way we use the word dream? Had a dream last night? No, that's not the idea here. Literally, here he's talking about their thinking. So to begin with, when you think about those who are apostatizing, they are people who have improper thinking. How often do we go back to that prodigal son in Luke chapter 15? When did he go back home? When he came to himself. People living in sin are not thinking right. And so when he came to himself, he realized the condition that he was in. And so these people live in a dream world, if you please. Their thinking is all messed up. Go back to Genesis chapter 6 and verse 5. What did God say about the world of that day? Their mind is on evil continually. Every thought and imagination of man's heart is evil continually. And so if that's what we're thinking, then what should we expect of our actions? They're going to follow suit. You think about those passages like Proverbs 4 and verse 23, Proverbs 23 and verse 7. As he thinketh in his heart, so is he. And so when you see these people in this verse, he talks about dreamers who defile the flesh. So they're living in a dream world. They're living in a world of impurity in that regard. Then he talks about defiling the flesh. What's involved in defiling the flesh? Not only would we suggest that they have improper thinking, but we'd also suggest that they have immoral habits. When you think about matters of the flesh, what passages might come to mind? Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 to 21, lists the works of the flesh. Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these. Where does he begin? With matters of immorality, adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, and such like. You don't want to leave off that last phrase, because he is specific in the list of sins that he classifies as the works of the flesh. But then he incorporates much beyond the specifics when he says, and such like. So in that list of things, and this is one of the, I think, the clearest illustrations that we usually have, when he talks about drunkards. Now there he's very specific. Interestingly enough, the word drunkard there is not really talking about one who is so out of it with alcohol that he doesn't know what he's doing. Literally, the word there involves the process of becoming. So what's more like that than social drinking for the benefit of those who want to try to justify social drinking? You've got drunkenness or the process of becoming drunk and such like. What would that incorporate? Well, if it doesn't incorporate social drinking, I wouldn't know what would. And so those who try to justify those kinds of things apparently have not studied sufficiently those passages of Scripture. And so, again, you look at Romans chapter 1, with where Paul begins by talking about the wrath of God. And we're familiar with verse 16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it's the power of God and salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Verse 17, for therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith unto faith, that is, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. But then where does he go in verse 18? But the wrath of God. And then he begins to talk about people who, even though they knew God, glorified Him not as God. And 3 times in those next few verses, he talks about God giving them up, God giving them over. And then he begins, we're down about verse 22, 23, with that long list of sins, of which those who do not like to retain God in their knowledge, sins of which they are guilty. Then you come down to verse 32, and how does he conclude that section? Not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. Now that covers a lot of territory. And so as Jude describes these men who have crept in unawares, he said they're living in a dream world. Their imagination, their mind is not focused upon the mind, upon the will of God. As a result of their thinking not being right, then he talks about their conduct. They defile the flesh. And then you'll notice, where does he go from there? Despise dominion and speak evil of dignities. So not only do they have improper thinking, not only do they have immoral habits, but they have irreverent hearts. No respect. Despise dominion. What is the word dominion and dignities in this verse? What does it suggest? Authority. Those in authority. And so here are people, because of the thinking that they have, because of the conduct that they have, he basically says they don't have any respect for anybody. And I've often thought, and believe it to be the case, that oftentimes those who have no respect for other people obviously have no respect for themselves. Because that speaks volumes against them when they act in those kinds of ways. And so there's contempt for authorities. You turn back to 2 Peter chapter 2 and in verse 10. But chiefly them that walk after the flesh in the lust of uncleanness, despise governments. Presumptuous are they, self-willed. They're not afraid to speak evil of dignities. Now, who are these people? They're people who walk after the flesh. Who are the people that Jude is describing in these verses? People who defile the flesh. And so those that Peter talks about and those that Jude talks about are the same kind of people. Their thinking is wrong, their conduct is wrong, their hearts are wrong. All of that is involved in these people. So there's no restraint for which they have respect. So dominion, dignities, they have no respect for it. Who would that include? Well, it would obviously include civil government, would it not? They don't care anything about civil government. They're going to do what they want to do. But what's the context of the book of Jude? We're talking Christians. So here are people who have crept in among them, who have no respect for dominion or dignities in the church. Who would that be? The elders primarily would be the consideration. And so they just have no reverence at all for anybody in authority. And they don't mind speaking out against them. But now wait a minute. Does that ring a bell? Are there times that we run across brethren who about the only thing they want to do is talk against the elders of the Lord's church? I mean, the elders can't do anything right. Everything they do is wrong. Their wisdom's wrong. Their decision-making's wrong. The worst group of men that ever hit the face of the earth. Who are those people? Well, Jude's describing them. Yes, sir. Yes. And unfortunately, and that was one of the first questions I asked when I moved here and was invited to the preacher's luncheon. What do you do? That's the first question I asked. What do you do? If you're going to sit around and elder bash, I have no interest in participating. If you want to get together and have a good meal together and laugh and talk and encourage one another and share good ideas and good stories or whatever, then that's fine. But when we look at these verses and see the nature of these people who despise and speak evil of dignities, those people have no qualms about talking adversely against the elders of the Lord's church. Now, what do those people usually wind up doing? If they begin to talk against the elders, what are they ultimately going to do? They're going to rebel against them. That's a violation of God's law. And so when you see that kind of thing taking place, you need to beware. Who are these people? Why are they talking that way? Where's that coming from? Well, that's the very thing that Jude is helping us to see in these verses with regard to the causes of apostasy. There's a thinking problem, there's a heart problem, there's a conduct problem, and it's all manifest in the lives of these people. So they have no show of respect as they set at naught any law, any authority that places upon them any kind of checks and balances. They don't want any part of that. But now, if I recall correctly, Paul in the Galatian letter more than once speaks of those who are children of God as people who have been liberated. We're at liberty. Does that not give us the liberty to talk the way we want to talk and do the things we want to do? No. No, it does not. We have been set free from certain things. We've been set free from the guilt of sin. We've been set free from the law of Moses. But that doesn't mean we've been set free to do whatever we want to do, how, when, and where we want to do it. And so we have to be cautious in that regard. Then in verse 9 he mentions Michael, the archangel. When contending with the devil, he disputed about the body of Moses, durst not bring against him a railing accusation, but saith, The Lord rebuke thee. Now, don't lose focus here as to why he brings Michael into this picture. Now, as far as a lot of things we don't know about what is said in verse 9. And so we don't need to make more out of this verse than is to be there. Now, Michael is mentioned in several places in the Bible. He seems to be the prince angel, if you please, of the Jewish people. There are things that we know about him. We know his name. It's given in this verse, Michael. We know that he served as an archangel. We know that he contended with Satan over Moses' body. We know that he refused to rail against or at Satan. We know that he left rebuking of Satan in God's hands. Now, what else do we know about him? Nothing. That's it. And so I know that, when we read a verse like this, we start trying to pinpoint other situations somewhere in the Bible that's going to give us a clue to what Jude's talking about, when this happened, where did it happen, how did it happen, what's the deal? No, we don't know all of that. So you just have to leave it there. There's no need to get into all the speculation that generally comes up from that. It's not important. Why does he bring Michael up at this point and tell us what he does about him? It's based on verse 8. These people who are creating apostasy speak evil, they despise dignities and speak evil, despise dominion and speak evil of dignities. But you see, even when Michael, in these circumstances, disputing about the body of Moses, didn't bring accusation even against the devil. There's the point of verse 9. These people are bringing accusation against dominion, against dignities. Michael wouldn't even bring accusation against the devil. So he just brings this up to show us how far out of line these people in verse 8 are by speaking evil of dignities. That's his whole point in verse 9. It's not to introduce another subject. It's not to generate a lot of speculation in that regard, but he just wants us to see that even an archangel didn't speak evil of the devil in the same fashion that these false teachers are speaking evil against the dignities of their day. That's how far off base they are. It makes it even worse. Exactly. And that's the real point of verse 9. But look at verse 10 and it'll show you that. So you got the closing part of verse 8, speak evil of dignities. Verse 9, here's what Michael, archangel, didn't do. Verse 10, but, it's right in the midst of that, but these speak evil of those things which they know not. That even intensifies it more, doesn't it? They speak evil. Now he tells us that they're even speaking evil against things about which they know nothing. That's an interesting concept in itself. So here's an utter abandonment to sin. Their arrogant actions, their beastly behavior is mentioned here in verse 10. Have you ever heard of anybody giving their opinion about something about which they know nothing? You ever heard anybody do that? If you've got ears, you've heard that. I mean, they've got all the solution, they've got all of the answers about something about which they know nothing. They're always willing to give their advice. Example. Where can you get your best advice on how to rear children? From somebody who's never had children. Yeah. People who've had children will tell you right quick, all I can do is sympathize with you. I mean, I tried to raise 3 and I know the troubles we had and, I don't have the answers. I wish I had the answers, but I don't have. But people who've never had children can give you all of the answers. Yeah, they can tell you exactly how to do it. What are they doing? They're talking about things about which they know nothing. in the church. And I guess I'm picking on elders a little bit this morning. I like my elders. Have you ever figured that out? But how many times have you heard people say, well, I tell you what, if I was an elder of that church, I'll tell you what I'd do about that situation. Number one, they know nothing about being an elder. And in all probability, they know nothing about the situation about which they're speaking. But they've got the answers. They can tell you exactly how the elder is supposed to handle it. They can tell you exactly what they're supposed to do. They know nothing about being an elder. They know nothing about the situation. They've got the answers. What does that say to you and to me in that regard? It says to you and to me, we need to be very, very careful about running our mouths about things about which we know nothing. We need to be careful about running our mouths about things, even things that we do know about. But we need to be careful. You know, none of us have a monopoly on wisdom and understanding about life. And that was the one thing I always appreciated about my parents. When Ann and I were newlyweds, and then the children came along and trying to rear our children, and some of the difficulties that we may have faced along the way, the only time they gave advice was when we asked for it. Now, I guarantee you that not every grandparent, I'm not even sure I can say that about myself relative to my kids and their kids. But that was the only time my parents ever gave advice, was when they were asked for it. And that's pretty good advice. Oftentimes we stick our noses in families, in the church, in society, on the job. We offer our 2 cents worth when we don't even have 2 cents worth. I remember on one occasion, a secretary I had, not here, and it wasn't Joyce, but a secretary I had just really opened up one day about a situation that was happening in the church. And she said, now that's my 2 cents worth. Well, I just put my hand in my pocket and pulled out a penny and gave her a penny back. I said, I don't think your advice is worth 2 cents. I'm going to give you some change back. That didn't go over well, but that's exactly the way I felt about it. But see, that a lot of people are always ready and willing to give their advice, aren't they? Look at this phrase. Speaking evil of things which they know not. Let's be careful. Let's be careful about our speech in that regard. He further says about these people, but what they know naturally as brute beasts, in those things they corrupt themselves. Here they are speaking evil about things about which they know nothing. Things that they do know are of what nature? Of a beastly nature. Shows the utter corruptness, that the point that they've reached in this regard. In those things, what things? Well, he's already told us back in verse 8, things of the flesh. You see, that's where they are. That's where they really have an education. Have you ever heard anybody described as being street smart? What does that usually mean, say somebody's street smart? It means they've been educated on the street. It means they know what's going on the streets and in the alleys, and so that's where their education is. And that's usually not too much of a compliment. Well, these people were flesh smart. They knew a lot about the ways of the flesh. That's not a compliment to these people. But where are they? They've crept in among brethren. In all probability, apostate brethren, who have allowed the ways of the flesh to corrupt them, and now they're trying to corrupt others. And so they act like beasts, even in those things that they do know. They're not even acting right there. So there's verses 8, 9, and 10. There's the cause of apostasy. Their thinking, their lack of respect, and their conduct. That's what brings about apostasy. Now, if they could get their thinking straight, they get their conduct straight, begin to respect the law of God as well as other laws, then they get back on the right track. But as long as their thinking, their action, and their lack of respect is where it is, they are not going to be faithful children of God. That was true then. It's true now. Now keep in mind, going back to verses 5, 6, and 7, those that came out of Egypt, the angels that kept not their first estate, cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities round about, what did they face? The judgment of God. Well, what about these people? What are they going to face? The very same thing. That's why these things are all tied together. As they acted, so these are acting. As those were going to receive judgment from God, so are these going to receive judgment from God. And the same principle is true today. Those who are guilty of these same kinds of things today will answer to God as well. Now in verses 11, in verse 11 specifically, he's going to help us to see the course of apostasy. So he's helped us to see the cause of it. Now he's going to help us to see the course. Where is it going to lead? What can we expect from people like that, besides what little bit he's already said about their conduct as being brute beasts? Verse 11, woe unto them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, and ran greedily after the error of Balaam for reward, and perished in the gainsaying of Korah. So here's the course. Now, so in this section he mentions three individuals, names three individuals, to let the reader see the course that these kind of people are going to travel. Now we are familiar, or should be familiar with these, but he begins the verse by saying, woe. What does that suggest? Huh? That's not like saying woe to a mule. You're going to show your rear in there if you're not careful. Not like woe to a mule. Stop. The word woe, woe unto them. What does that suggest? Misery, punishment. That's what the word woe really suggests in this regard. That punishment inevitably is going to descend on these people. So it's of a warning nature here. Yes, it would. When you see that word, it ought to generate a cautious attitude. I don't want to be caught where these people are. I don't want to be guilty of those things, because inevitably there is destruction. You go back to some of Jesus' statements during his earthly ministry. In Matthew chapter 23, notice what he says in verse 13. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For ye neither go in yourselves, neither suffer ye them that are entering to go in. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites! What is that? That's a pronouncement of judgment against them. You come down to verse 15 or verse 14. Woe unto you. Verse 15. Woe unto you. What's he doing? He's warning of the inevitability of the judgment against people who do what these scribes and Pharisees are doing. He refers to them as hypocrites. And so maybe to us, in a very mild way, it would say, you better stop. But the word woe in the Scripture means a lot more than that. So woe unto them. In the here as well, and you go back Go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 9 for just a moment, and you'll see a parallel, I think. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and in verse 16. For though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yea, woe is unto me, if I preach not the gospel. Now, as far as I know, in the book of Jude, verse 11, and 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 16, are the only places in the epistles that this phrase is used. And so you see the dynamics involved when you see the context in which these words are used. Very serious matter. So who are the people that he talks about? Woe unto them. They've gone the way of Cain. Well, what do we know about Cain? How did Cain act? Well, before that, what was Cain's attitude? What has he just got through saying up here about these people? They don't like dignities and they don't like dominion. What about Cain? Cain's attitude basically is one, I'm going to do it my way regardless of what God says about it. I mean, there's the bottom line. I'm going to do it my way. How much of the religious world does that encompass today? Most, exactly. I mean, that's why so many different religious organizations exist. Because people are saying we're going to do it our way regardless of what the Bible teaches. I know that's what it says, but then you just butted God right out of it. That's the problem with Cain. And so it was that of disobedience. He tampered with the truth. Did he know what to do? Did he know how to do it? How do you know? Do we know that? All right, what are we told about Abel? By faith. Faith comes how? By hearing the Word of God. So there's no doubt that Cain as well as Abel were told by God exactly what was to be involved in those sacrifices. Abel chose to do it God's way. Cain chose to do it his way. And so he tampered with the truth. Does that sound a bell? Wow. All right. We'll pick up, Lord willing, right here next Sunday morning and look at these three characters and make some applications.